Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Real Talks. I'm your host, David Steele, and I'm once again joined by Benjamin. How are we, Benjamin?
Doing pretty good.
Fantastic.
Not too busy, not too sick, so we're good.
There you go. So, as you may or may not have seen yet, and they're still getting posted, Benjamin and I talked about a video game for about an hour, one of the better video games out there for about an hour the other day, and that was The Last of Us. Well, Naughty Dog wasn't finished because about 4 or 5 years later, they came out with The Last of Us Part 2. And it was actually released in 2020. And it's interesting how art imitates life and vice versa. But it actually began development soon after the first one. And so Neil Druckmann had actually returned. He was the creative director at this point with Haley Gross. And, obviously because of the pandemic, there was some delays. But it actually got released in June of 2020. And this, I have to say, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, Benjamin, this is probably the best video game ever made and developed out there. And I would say that this is absolutely the most divisive video game out there. What do you think?
Divisive, I agree. Best, I'm not sure. I've played it too soon to give it such a label, and contrast, I've put in way more hours into Hollow Knight, more hours into Elden Ring, even Bloodborne, and other games I consider some of my favorites of all time. But in terms of raw storytelling, it is second to none. I'll give it that for sure.
This game, there are so we are going to go through 5 points as we did with our first video. We are going to go through the 5 points that really make this one of. And we should say this. Just like film, and I always say film is subjective, video games is subjective, because at the end of the day, they're art. But some people love this game, and some people absolutely hate this game. So what we're going to do is go through 5 points and talk about the 5 points and really about this game and walk through each one of them. So before we do that though, when was the first time you played The Last of Us Part 2, Benjamin?
I started it in November of 2022. I had just finished The Last of Us Part 1. And about halfway through that game, I was like, I'm going to buy Part 2. I'm going to pay full price. I don't care. Had I waited 2 more weeks, it would have gone on sale for like 85% off. But I was like, whatever. I want to give it a try. I'm loving Part 1. Let's see what happens. And so I bought this game before I'd even finished Part 1. But I knew what happened in Part 1. I'd already been spoiled on everything. I was just journeying through it. And I knew one thing about this game. That was Joel and his tragic ending. And that's it. I knew about him. I knew that people didn't like Abby. And that you play as Ellie for most of the game. So I was like, cool. All right, this is going to be fun. I'm expecting pretty similar characters. I've only heard of this stuff. I did not expect the game to start with me playing Ellie, introduced to completely new characters for most of its runtime. I didn't expect for Joel to be as small and yet as big of a role as he is. I did not anticipate half of the stuff you do with Abby. The game surprised me time and time again. I knew there was 4 days, relatively. I follow Story Street on Twitter, and he played through the game like while I was playing through Part 1, and he was tweeting like photos and like just observations. And I was tempted to mute him because I was like, I don't want any spoilers, but thankfully it wasn't too bad. So like I knew a few things, but I didn't anticipate anything of what happened And the 6-week journey it took me to play through 12 chapters is insane.
Yeah.
So,
okay, I'm going to be basic and put it out there for you guys. Spoilers. So, and he kind of alluded to it. So, in the first, I would say, half an hour maybe, one of the most beloved characters in the game, the first game, gets absolutely brutally murdered. And I was actually just watching a playthrough of somebody the other day, first reaction, and she was in tears. And because it's one of those things you just don't see coming. It's out of left field. And I really think that this is why I think it's really, really divisive. And we'll get into other points in a few minutes, but it's, wow, what a beginning. I mean, there's no other way, but it's a shock. Mm-hmm. And people go, why did they kill Joel? We'll get into that in a little bit. So the first point, and really the first point I really want to touch upon, is the trauma and pain, or as you put it, the elephant in the room. When we are introduced to Abby, and how we're introduced to Abby, and why the game does what it does. Give me your thoughts when you're playing through it the first time and you're watching this cutscene. What were you thinking?
I want to start before the cutscene because you say there's half an hour. I think there's a half hour that you desperately remember because of the build up to that pain. It's close to an hour and a half. It's like a 90-minute prologue where you're playing as Ellie, you're playing briefly as Joel, and then you play as Abby. And I think how this game builds and builds and builds to that moment, and it does it shockingly, but it also makes it very clear who these people are. You have Joel and Tommy and their discussion before he gives Ellie a guitar, right? As they're talking about what he did in Jackson. And it immediately sets the tone of this game. It is not going to ignore what happened at the end of the last game. And if anything, this game is about that aftermath. This is the part 2 of that game's ending. And more importantly, it's about Ellie and her relationship to what happened 5 years ago in that hospital in St. Mary's. Right? And it's brilliantly set like that so that we immediately know where people's headspace is at. You have Ellie who's playing through, and when you start her day, it seems like a pretty normal day. You've got her talking to Dina and Jesse. There was apparently some events that happened last night where Dina made a move on her, and they got yelled at by some older gentlemen, and Joel apparently came in and rough and toughed some people. And Ellie's clearly processing all of this, and if you read her journals, it's like, why did she do this? She has good friendship. She's throwing it all away. It's brilliant. And it goes a step further than that, though, because you have these discussions, and it seems like, man, Joel and Ellie are like on solid, firm footing. You know, we have this opening scene with the guitar, and she's listening to music, and it's like, yeah, this is the life I wanted them to have. And then you have Abby's entries. And you start playing as Abby on a mission run. You don't really know what you're doing. She's clearly approached Jackson with a group of people, and it kind of is teaching you some of the basics of the parkour tutorial that you wouldn't naturally get as Ellie, which is really brilliant. That's a good gameplay decision because it sets the tone while also giving you insight into things that will be completely needed for the rest of the game. And she's talking with these people. They're looking for someone, and you don't know who. But if you know what, spoilers, I knew who they're looking for. And it hit me in that moment that I'm like, oh, shit.
We did good back there. Doc, that girl showed up. What girl? The one Marlene keeps talking about. They found her in the tunnels. She has an old bite mark on her arm, No signs of infection. That can't be. They're already running tests on her, but you gotta get down there.
It's like praying. I was like, please don't make me do it. I do not have the strength as a player. And so you have to play as Abby's entries, where she's talking to people and doing exactly what Ellie is doing in Jackson. Talking with people. She's got a friend who's pregnant while they're out on a mission. I mention that because that's what happens later when Ellie and Dina go to Seattle. You have this camaraderie that comes with these people as they're all on a single quest. And yet they're not all completely unified, and Abby ends up going out into a snowstorm. And you hope that she's not looking for Joel, even though I know she is. I hope she isn't. And then Joel finds her. And it's at that moment that you start to, like, break on the inside. Because I know people might get mad about Deus Machina in film. And I agree. Deus Machina sucks if you're the protagonist and the protagonist doesn't get to make choices. If you're the antagonist, go to town. Feel free. Make the world as unfair as possible for our protagonists. They have to make choices. The fact that Abby has multiple times the possibility to die, not just in the opening segment, but throughout the entire game, and she's repeatedly saved by other people, make it hurt all that much more when Joel and Tommy help her to safety, and they're like, hey, do you guys need supplies? Can we help you? And Tommy gets taken away and Joel gets blasted with a shotgun. It's painful, and yet it immediately sets this tone. And I mention all of this build-up because then you have to go from Ellie, who's having what seems like a pretty normal, if not chipper day, of we're going out, we're chattering with Dina, talking about Jesse, talking about relationships, talking about how she and Joel are going to be spending the night watching a movie, maybe a cheesy movie Joel loved before the apocalypse. And immediately, you see her start to take on the stuff because she and Dina decided to find a place to bunker down during a blizzard instead of looking for Joel and Tommy. Because that's what this game is. People like to say it's trauma porn, and I can disagree with it. It is extremely traumatic. It is painful. It is hard. And the moment that golf club comes down, you're hurting. You're hurting as much as Ellie's hurting. And it's going to continue doing this the rest of the game. There's no point in the game where you will not be emotionally exhausted. But I think that's really important. I think it's something art needs to explore.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It absolutely makes sense because that first prologue that you're talking about really sets the stage for what's to come. And so Ellie eventually ends up, Joel and Tommy hadn't come back. And then they find Ellie finds the house, and she goes in, and she's essentially captured and held down, and she has to watch the only person that she's loved die in front of her. And if you actually want to go back to the first,
I wouldn't say the only
person,
but the only person left.
Well, one of the only people. And if you go back to that scene we were talking about the other day, and after she runs away, and she says, you want to, give me up, but you're one of the only people that have not left me. And that's how much she cared about him, their relationship. And so from that, what ends up happening is they go back to Jackson, and Tommy wants to do something, but, so he goes to Ellie and says, hey, are you okay? Because Ellie wants to go after him. And then they don't have enough people. And so she's like, fine, I'm leaving in the morning. You can come with me or not. Mm-hmm. And basically puts Tommy and Maria to an ultimatum. And eventually what ends up happening is Maria finds out, gets wind of this, and then, she allows him to leave. And that's going to do it for this episode. Stay tuned in the coming days for the rest of the breakdown we did with Benjamin about The Last of Us Part 2 and what makes it one of the greatest games of all time. Guys, we are only 6 short days away from one of the biggest series dropping on not only HBO Max, but the channel. And I'm talking about The Last of Us. Stay tuned after the episode. Kyle, myself, Destiny, and Tyler will be doing a breakdown and giving our thoughts about it. Guys, if you like this episode or any of the other episodes we've been doing here on the channel, give us a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. It's the only way that I know you're enjoying the content. And please, guys, leave a comment. Did you like The Last of Us? Did you like it more than the first game? Were you upset with what happened? Okay, guys, do the 3 things we need to do. Be careful, be safe, and have a great day. I'm David Steele, and you have been watching Real Talks.